Hi, I'm Maggie Koerth-Baker, and I'm the science editor at boingboing.net.
And I'm Christina Agapakis. I'm a synthetic biologist at UCLA, and I blog at Scientific American.
Welcome to another Science Saturday. This is going to be kind of a weird one for Christina and I, because we actually recorded this conversation yesterday, and then QuickTime failed. So we're having the same conversation for a second time, and hopefully we will not be too weird about that.
It's going to be great. We're going to be we're experts in this conversation now.
Totally, yeah. We've had this conversation more times than anyone else. I was going to start off I realized at the end of our conversation yesterday that you had a new position and you were no longer in Boston, but out in California. So congratulations on that, and tell us a little bit about what you're doing now.
Well, so I just got my PhD, and I'm now a postdoc at UCLA. I'm working in the Department of Chemical Engineering, and I'm sort of working in a lab that works on a lot of biofuel production methods, so trying to produce fuels in bacteria. And I'm also teaching chemical engineers about biology and biotechnology. So it's a fun really job. Cool. I've just started sort of getting the hang of everything, but it's been really fun so far.
Nice. When did you start that?
Oh, in September. So it still feels new. I've been here for a couple of months, though. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, so I had just gotten back from a energy conference in DC last month, and you had mentioned that you were interested in hearing a little bit more about that. Can you tell me a little bit about what you were particularly curious about?
Yeah, so I saw an article that you wrote about sort of imagining the future in the next sort of 20 years, which I know is also what your book is about, sort of thinking about the future of energy. And it was really fascinating to sort of read that and sort of think about how technologies, how sort of simple changes in technology that we have today could sort of influence the sort of future technology that's going to help us sort of find new alternative energy sources and more sustainable uses of energy. So that was sort of, I guess, the general theme of the things that I saw from you and the things that I was really interested in. So I wanted to just hear more about sort of what the conference was about and sort of where, what inspired some of these sort of analyses of the technology and what we have.
Yeah, absolutely. So the conference was called What Will Turn Us On in 2030, and it's part of Future Tense, which is kind of a joint collaboration of Slate.com and the New American Foundation, along with Arizona State University. And what we were talking about is, just this very short-term picture of the future of energy. Everybody's talking about how we want to change energy in the long term, but what are we really looking at for like the next 20 or 30 years? And I think that we succeeded at that to some extent and not to others, because I think that a lot of what we ended up talking about were technologies that are really awesome sounding, but not necessarily things that are going to be really ready in 20 years. So there was a lot of discussion about driverless cars and micro nukes and trying to think of some of the other things that came up. But things that are just really awesome and have a lot of really cool whiz-bang behind them, but that are going to be really, either not quite ready even yet in 20 years, or ready but not well integrated into society in 20 years. So I think that it kind of got to a lot of, what I see as sort of a disconnect between our short-term goals and our long-term goals with energy, that we have to be planning for both time frames, but the stuff for the short time frame is not nearly as exciting, so it's not nearly as much fun to talk about when you actually sit down and talk about energy.
I was just going to say, when I started my PhD, I guess 5 years ago now, I was working on hydrogen and actually producing hydrogen as a fuel using biology. And
Oh,
there's
yeah.
sort of some really interesting for me as a biologist, that was really interesting sort of talking about the enzymes that produce hydrogen and all these sort of exciting pathways. But hydrogen as a actual source of fuel that could actually, run hydrogen cars, everyone was always saying, hydrogen is always, 10 years in the future. And, 5 years in, it is still, 10, 20 years in the future. So it is very interesting to sort of think about, how these sort of more sort of out there and kind of interesting ideas aren't actually, don't have the sort of practicality that you need to actually make something happen in the next 10 years, really.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the reasons that we don't talk about the stuff that is really short-term based is because it's stuff that is really centered around energy efficiency, which is much less cool, I guess. I know that when efficiency did come up at the conference, and I was really pleased that it did in this context, it was in the context of vehicles and how we can, have a more sustainable transportation system. And so you had one person on stage talking about driverless cars and all this research that Google has been putting into those. And then you have a couple of other people who are there really talking about making the vehicles we already have more energy efficient, which is a lot cheaper to do in the short term and makes a huge difference. So I think one of the people there was a guy from Audi, and he was talking about how they have a new SUV that's going to be coming out that still seats 7 people and can still pull a sailboat behind it, but it weighs 800 pounds less than the previous model. And
do they just have different materials?
Yeah.
How do they? Is that the?
So
how do they make it
that,
so much lighter?
Yeah. Well, so they're doing that with actually using a lot of, if I'm recalling correctly, they did that using a lot of like thinner materials that are also strong, and also kind of changing some of the way that they have the engine set up so that you don't need quite as much heavy equipment in the engine to begin with. And because it wasn't based on, really high-tech, expensive materials either. It was based on small changes to make this vehicle more energy efficient than the previous version, with the idea that better is better, that, you're not getting to perfect with this, but you're getting to better, and that's good. And I think that's really important. I mean, I think we don't talk about that kind of stuff enough, and I think that for the short term, it's going to be things like that that make this huge difference for us and get us on the road to where we are going to be able to use these longer term technologies that we're developing later on.
So I'm wondering, I mean, I just bought a used Prius, and I know that hybrid cars have been around for a long time, I think about 10 years. And so I'm wondering, like, sort of, was there any talk, or do you know anything about sort of like, I know that at least out here in LA, a lot of cars are hybrid already, but why isn't it already, in 10 years, 100%? There's a few older cars. So why aren't all new cars hybrid? Why aren't they, there? The technology seems like it's there to be able to get at least significantly better gas mileage, but that's not actually being deployed at 100% yet. So I was wondering, what do you think about that? Or do we know what the reasons are there?
So there's a couple of things going on here, and some things I know about and some things I don't necessarily know much about, so I'll try to start with the stuff I can talk about a little bit. If you're talking about just, why don't more people drive hybrids already? And a lot of that has to do with the turnover rate for vehicle purchasing, because, you buy a vehicle for decades, not for a couple of years. And so it takes, I'm trying to remember how long I was told that it takes for the U.S. vehicle fleet to completely turn over. But I think it's something on the order of, 2 or 3 decades, a long time. Okay. And for a new technology to work its way in, something like, a Prius, that actually takes longer because you have a curve of, not everybody wants to be the first adopter. You had back in the 70s, people got scared off of diesel engines because a lot of people were first adopters on diesel systems that didn't work very well. And then we had, another 20 or 30 years before the American public really started to become comfortable with buying diesel engines at all again. So I think there are a lot of people that are kind of scared off of that. There are a lot of people that have a car already and have no need to buy a brand new one simply because it gets better gas mileage. And it also depends on, what you're upgrading from makes a big difference, which is interesting, was really interesting to me, because my understanding is that if you are, if you drive a car right now that gets like 10 or 15 miles per gallon, then it completely makes sense to buy something like a Prius. But if you own a car already that gets like 35 miles a gallon, there's much less of an incentive for you to, add 10 miles a gallon or 15 miles a gallon to what you already have for the amount of cost. So there's all these incentives that work out into why people make the choices they make about vehicles. I don't know necessarily why there aren't more hybrids on the market already, more options for people to buy. I think probably a lot of that just has to do with, knowing, with conservatism, not conservatism politically, but conservatism in a business sense of nobody wants to put all their eggs in one basket.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, so then given that kind of reluctance, how much do you think that these sort of the new models, like the Audi person was talking about at the conference, like the things that are going to be more efficient, how much of a real sort of tangible change is that going to make in the short term? Do you think that it's going to be, again, like, slowly people will start, eventually all of the cars will use this sort of thinner and lighter technology. And so, by then, who knows, other things will have come along. I don't know. Is that something that was discussed at all, or you think of?
It wasn't something we talked about much about at all, but it is definitely something I think about a lot, because I think whenever you're talking about a product with a long period of ownership that you're expecting to get out of it, you're talking about a long time to have a turnover rate to get to some kind of peak of people buying that newer, better product. And where this comes up a lot is one of the things that we are lacking in America is electrical storage on the scale of like our electrical grid. And people have proposed these systems that could use, plug-in hybrid cars as storage systems for the grid that you could, take and give back and forth between those batteries instead of having to buy great big batteries for the utility systems themselves. But you run into this problem of, how many people do you need to have that car before you can actually make use of this really promising system? You have to have this critical mass, and until you get to that critical mass, you don't necessarily have something that can work the way you want it to work. And there's a lot of unknowns that go into that. One of the things that I have found really interesting is people's efforts to speed up that process of, changing vehicles and changing out the American vehicle fleet. There's a researcher at the University of Delaware who is working on this way of basically paying people for the use of their electric car batteries the same way that we pay utility companies and utility generators now for the use of their generating systems to balance the grid and to make the grid work. And so his idea is that you would take 100 or 1,000 car owners and aggregate them together through this third-party service so that they behave as one giant battery, essentially. And so you never have to take more than a little bit off of anybody's battery in their car.
That's really interesting.
And then if you're getting paid for owning this electric vehicle, if there's a way for you to actually make money off of this, then maybe you're more likely to make that jump from your 35-mile-a-gallon car to, something that gets a little bit better than that, but is more expensive up front.
That's really interesting. it seems like it also is related to sort of the history of electrification in the first place, because I remember in your article you mentioned toasters were involved and sort of these like home appliances were involved in getting the sort of grid that we have in place in the first place, because people weren't actually using enough electricity to make it worth it to build those kinds of power plants and those kinds of facilities that we need to have the grid that we have today, which seems sort of, I don't know, is it again sort of counterintuitive that you have to use more in order to like be more efficient? I don't know. Is that the sort of trade-off that is that a real kind of thing, or I don't know?
So to kind of give people background on this, one of the things I talked about in my speech at this conference and in the Slate article that Christina's talking about is that, for 40 years after the first electric grids were built in the world, which were in the U.S., electricity was not a profitable industry. Like, you had all of these utility companies failing over and over, some of them multiple times. And the reason was that people didn't use enough electricity to justify the cost of building the infrastructure to carry electricity to people. So there was no way that you could actually make your money back off of light bulbs alone. And it wasn't until the 1920s, at which point the utility companies themselves had made this concerted effort to invent electric appliances out of thin air, electric curling irons, electric toaster ovens. We have these things because utility companies needed extra sources of electricity consumption. It wasn't until that happened that people were actually able to make a business out of electricity. And I think that there is definitely some of that comes into play when we're looking at these issues with, you have to have enough people buying this car before you can use this car as a battery, thus saving money by not having to buy the battery for the grid, and thus allowing you to have more wind and solar power on the grid because you have the battery. I mean, all these things are interconnected, and there is a lot of, what step has to happen first to make everything else work. I'm not quite sure exactly what you're asking, though, in terms of consumption. Can you explain a little bit more on what you're thinking?
I guess what I'm thinking is that, is it worth it in the end? Like, when we're talking about sort of sustainability and being able to sort of use less, but we have to consume more in order to to have the grid be more efficient. I don't know if that seems sort of counterproductive. I guess is that
we don't actually have to. We don't have to consume more to have the grid be more efficient. The issue with the grid is that you basically have to have the same level of consumption and production almost equal going in and out at any given time. So you can consume less, but then you also have to produce less. And those two things can't get out of whack, which is why we have, right now, people sitting in control centers all over the U.S. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, monitoring this and trying to balance out those fluctuations. Okay,
that makes sense. I think I'm remembering also part of Alexis Madrigal's book, and when he was talking sort of about similar ideas in the grid and how amusement parks actually were sort of built near the terminals of the grid in order to sort of keep up to sort of balance out the use of electricity. So they have all these light bulbs and all these rides going at night, and that would sort of maintain a constant load on the grid that they weren't able to maintain in the olden days.
Yeah, that's another thing. Electricity companies owned the first amusement parks, and also incidentally ran the electric trolley cars that took you to the amusement park. So they got another source of consumption out of that as well.
That's pretty interesting.
And that wasn't so much. That was somewhat about balancing the grid, but also about being able to make enough money off of the grid to recoup their investments.
That's really interesting. I now just remembered thinking we're talking about grids, and you mentioned sort of micro nuclear reactors and sort of smaller kinds of electrical production that could sort of get you off the grid. Is how much was sort of talked about that? Micronuclear reactors sounds sort of crazy, and is that a real thing that people can do,
is a real thing. And when you're talking about micro, it means a lot of different things, depending on who you're talking to. Like I have done a lot of research on decentralization of energy, which sounds like, oh, we're all going to go off the grid and live like hippies, but it's actually not. It's more like, your region or your state or maybe your city will be able to take advantage of generation resources that it has available nearby and produce generation on a smaller scale than we produce today. We actually need the kind of interconnection to stabilize things and to make sure that we all have the electricity we need. Going completely off the grid is okay, but it kind of leaves you up to some risk and makes you vulnerable in a way that decentralization, which is sort of a bigger sort of little, doesn't. But to talk about the micronuclear, that is actually a thing, and there are lots of different people who have worked on some of these ideas, and for the most part, a lot of it has been about how you get energy generation to places that don't have infrastructure already built. So if you want to have electricity in the middle of Africa, maybe you could have a smaller sort of nuclear power plant that produces electricity on a smaller scale than what we use in the US. And that ranges then all the way to things that are a lot more experimental and imaginary, I guess, that are like, well, maybe we could have nuclear generators that are small enough that you could just have them in your backyard and your entire house would be powered just straight off of that. So there's a big range of ideas under what micronuclear actually means. And I think it's a really interesting idea. I think it has the same problems that nuclear generally has, which are both PR problems and technical problems. And because of those things, I don't necessarily see micronuclear going anywhere. I think it's one of those technologies that is really interesting in a theoretical way and can provide like some really great ideas for, if you're engaging in futurism and imagining what the future of energy could look like. But when you actually start applying those things to the real world and to people's opinions and to, there doesn't necessarily jive, I don't think. I just don't really see those having much of a future.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, not even the risks you take of putting in your own backyard. Your neighbors may not want you to have a nuclear reactor in your backyard. Yeah, that's really interesting. Go ahead.
I was just saying that the thing I always think about when people bring up that type of micronuclear is the old Far Side cartoon where the people are looking out their window and their neighbors have like a giant ICBM in the front yard and they're like, oh great, now the Hendersons have the bomb. And for some reason that's the comic I always think about.
That's really interesting. So working with hydrogen a few years ago, I mean, that was something that was definitely an issue too for us. And there is like these again, like kind of imaginations of what the future would be. And sort of, I don't know if it actually had been built or it was just like a sort of mock-up sort of from, I think it was Honda or another sort of, another company like that. They had these sort of mini fuel cells that you could have in your house. That'd be sort of your hydrogen fuel cell that you would use to power your electric car. And so you'd have it would be like local hydrogen storage instead of having to have hydrogen, shipping, which is a little bit more. A little more complicated and more difficult. And when we were working on hydrogen, everyone's like, oh no, isn't that going to blow up? Like, isn't hydrogen explosive? And he's like, well, that's actually the point, like gasoline is also explosive and that's why it's good. That's why it's good for your car. It has a lot of energy in it and it's a good fuel. And so, yeah, I don't know that it's hard. I mean, all of these technologies, anything that produces energy is dangerous. And there's a lot of, issues that go into it, and when it's centralized and, it's on the grid, we still have a lot of, dangerous things that happen and bad things that happen from mining coal and burning coal and to power those grids. And, if you have hydrogen, there's a risk of the hydrogen blowing up. And if you have nuclear reactors, you also have a big risk too. So it's hard to balance, I think, the risks and it's sort of hard to picture them too. And unless you kind of think about it, you're like, oh wow, well, if I had this in my actual backyard, that's really scary, but it actually is sort of in your backyard because the world is very connected. So I think that's just interesting. I guess I don't really have a final point.
Well, I think there's a difference between, you also get into problems when you're trying to think about the risks that we've gotten used to compared to the risks that you don't know as well, you're not as familiar with.
Yeah.
We bought this house that I'm in right now that was built in, I think, 1928. And the original garage was a tuck-under garage that went out the front of the house. And it's now my husband's wood shop, but if you go down there, it's got these, compared to the rest of my basement, it is like a bunker. It's basically a cement shell, and it had, metal cladding all around the inside and a metal door between it and the rest of the basement. And all of that was there because people were really worried about your car just spontaneously setting on fire at the time.
Wow. Was that something that happened?
I don't actually know.
Is it possible?
I have absolutely no idea. I'm assuming if it was possible,
maybe if you were driving it.
Yeah, and I have no idea. But
it
our
seems
house,
like parked. It would be. Huh.
Yeah, we just have basically a
That's
soundproof bunker in our basement, so that because people were scared of that.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. It's kind of fascinating, and it's, I think, something that, one of the things that I found really interesting looking at alternative energy is that somebody can always find something to be scared of, no matter what technology you're talking about. Even if you're talking about wind power, which is arguably one of the safest forms of energy we can think about, there are people that have big fears about what this rotating blade is doing to, atmospheric something or other near them, and feeling like it makes them sick, and feeling like it, damages the way their lifestyle and the way that they live, and actually oppose wind projects because of those fears. So, I think I think the big lesson is that as we're working on the future of energy, one of the things we need to pay more attention to is how we're going to deal with the fact that everything has downsides and nothing is perfect. And, even doing nothing has its own downsides. We have, we were talking about the risks of coal. I was doing some research for the book, and I think, if I'm recalling correctly, the studies I was looking at, there's some good estimations that burning coal in Europe kills upwards of 20,000 Europeans every year because of cancer, because of lung problems, just these everyday deaths that we don't really think about because they don't come in a big batch. And
everyday death sounds terrible, but yeah,
it does.
I see what you mean. Yeah,
yeah. And we don't think about those things because we've gotten used to that.
Yeah.
But it's something that you still have to consider, if you don't want to change because you're worried about what the new technology could do, well, you have to think about what the old technology does. And if you're worried about having no technology, if you think any technology is bad, you have to think about what the risks are of having no technology. And I don't think that we compare those risks in a, nuanced way often enough. That too often we're talking about specific fears, and rather than kind of pulling out and looking at the big picture and being like, okay, what are we willing to live with and what aren't we willing to live with? Because we have some level of risk we're willing to live with, or we wouldn't have the world we live in today.
That reminds me of one of the tweets I saw during the conference that was quoting Craig Venter, who was giving the keynote. And Craig Venter is a synthetic biologist and is sort of a pioneer in genomics and now synthetic genomics, and trying to sort of find new sources of energy using engineered algae. And I think that he said something like that that current technology is about fixing old technology. So we sort of have these problems now with burning coal, and so he's trying to make new technologies as an alternative source of energy. I thought that was really interesting and sort of really connects to what we've been talking about, that, you know, there's definitely risks involved in engineering cells and releasing them into the environment, or even accidentally having them be released into the environment. But at the same time, if we can get a source of energy that is cleaner and more efficient and more and safer, maybe those risks, you know, does that outweigh those risks or not?
Right.
So that seems really interesting. And I was wondering, now I can ask you more questions. So that you saw the talk, Koerth-Baker's talk, and I'm wondering sort of what you took away from that, and sort of where you see this kind of biotechnology contributing to energy. Is this something that's going to be, you know, 100 years in the future, or is it actually going to be able to be 10, 20 years in the future?
From listening to Craig Venter's talk, I got the impression that biotechnology is not a close source of energy. Because he was talking about how, you know, his team has done all this research looking for naturally occurring microbes and genes that can turn, you know, things like sugars into fuel sources. And they've not found a naturally occurring one that can do that at a scale that we would need to produce fuel without taking up, you know, just ridiculous amounts of land or ocean. So he's come to the conclusion that they're going to have to, you know, build something from scratch, build a cell from scratch that can make fuel. And I guess this is, you know, a question for you, since you're much more familiar with that field. You know, what's the timeline on something like that? Is that something that we could do in 20 years, or is that something that's going to take a lot longer?
Building a whole cell from scratch?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is sort of where I think that it's sort of much more feasible and interesting, and sort of the current way that people are approaching this is sort of not trying to start over completely, but by kind of sort of pushing things that are currently around, like current systems, current species of bacteria or algae that can do the kinds of things that we want them to do, maybe not at the right level that we would need, and sort of pushing that. You can use a sort of an artificial evolution, sort of even breeding method, you know, try and get them to produce more and more of the product, which is something that has happened, you know, over thousands of years with yeast that produce ethanol. So, you know, brewing yeast, you know, they produce a little bit of ethanol as part of their metabolism, and then sort of selecting the strains that make more and more. We've gotten up to a level now where you can have yeast that produce, I think, like 40% maybe is the, I should know this number, but I don't remember exactly. I think like 40% of the glucose gets converted into ethanol, or it's converted and then it can survive at sort of a concentration of 40% ethanol. It's one or the other. And so using these kinds of breeding methods and sort of, or engineering, sort of bringing genes from one organism that's really good at doing something, but, you know, maybe doesn't grow very fast or something like that, and sort of transplanting that gene into an organism that does grow fast and is good to grow inside of a lab. And so there's a lot of people working on this kind of field, and there's been a few companies that have sort of come out of this that produce fuels using these kinds of methods, like using yeast that are engineered with genes that can produce various sort of fuel-like molecules. And so I don't know the exact efficiencies and how it really compares. The numbers are usually really bad. It's like, oh yeah, we need to totally replace all the gasoline that's used. We'd have to have, you know, we'd have to cover the whole United States with the crops that we would need to feed to these bacteria, or we'd have to cover the whole United States with these bacteria that are photosynthetic by themselves. So you'd need algae ponds the size of China to be able to produce the kinds of energy that we need. So the numbers are definitely not there to completely replace it, but in sort of small, there's other applications I think that are really good and really useful. So if there's a chemical that is very difficult to produce or very bad for the environment to produce from petroleum, then you can actually make it in biology with a little bit, you know, at smaller scales if better. So there's definitely places where this is happening and is in the short term, totally replacing all of energy with biology is maybe a much larger scale problem. And I don't know if making cells from scratch is the right answer even in that case. But it's definitely a really sort of an interesting approach and a sort of really, really interesting technology at this stage.
And that's interesting to me because I think that kind of gets to that idea of, better is better. You can't replace everything, but maybe we can, take one use of petroleum and replace it with something that's made a little bit in a cleaner way. I think we forget a lot that we don't just use petroleum in our cars, that there's all these other things we do with it. And, if we could make some kind of plastics using biotechnology, or if we can do, something with fertilizer using biotechnology, then we've taken care of a big source of our energy use.
Yeah. The big challenge is really sort of where's the starting material coming from, right? So if it is coming from corn, as a lot of the ethanol production is coming now, and you sort of it's not very efficient, then we end up sort of having a bigger problem. So we're trying to make plastic out of corn, but we might actually be better off making plastic out of petroleum at that point.
Right.
And especially, talking about sort of nitrogen and fertilizers, right, and agriculture. Agriculture is one of the biggest sources of, uses of industrial agriculture is one of the biggest sources of sort of greenhouse gases and one of the biggest uses of energy. So if we need to scale up industrial agriculture in order to feed our biotechnology to be able to better do industrial agriculture, we're sort of in this weird problem too. So I think, there's these solutions to sort of these technical problems, but we have to really think about how they fit into the sort of the economics of, where that energy is coming from, where things are going.
Yeah, just because we can do something doesn't mean it makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. That kind of brings me to thinking about something that Venter also brought up in that keynote presentation at the conference, which was the risks of, having a fuel-producing synthetic bacteria. And I think the thing that I just had not thought about this before for some reason, but he was talking about, what happens if something like this gets out into the world, and if you have something that can turn, salt into some kind of hydrocarbon, oh my God, suddenly you have oceans full of lipids. I'm kind of curious, is that, he kind of blew that off as not something you even really need to worry about, and after bringing it up and freaking me out a lot. But I'm kind of curious, from your perspective as a synthetic biologist, how much of a concern is this idea of something that you create in a lab getting out into the real world? If something, is that necessarily a bad thing, or could you have, a synthetic bacteria get out into the real world and not have it really matter that much?
I think So it's definitely a big question, and a question that's really, really important. If we're going to actually scale up these kinds of things, things that are going on in labs now, we have organisms that can make little bits of fuels. If we're going to scale it up into a way that, the bacteria need to be out in sort of an open pond, in an open environment that could interact with the environment. These are issues that are really important and have to be taken really seriously. The current sort of understanding and the current way that most people sort of will kind of brush off this concern is saying that most of the synthetic organisms and the engineered organisms actually don't survive very well in the wild. They're sort of optimized to grow in the lab and to survive in the lab, and then once you bring them out into the sort of wild environment, they can't compete against natural organisms because all they can do really is produce the chemical that you want them to do. They can't do the things that they need to do to be able to adapt and survive in nature. So most people say, well, we probably don't have to worry too much because even if it got out, it's almost impossible that it would actually be able to grow and divide at all, let alone take over the whole ocean and fill the ocean with lipids. So that's something that people are thinking about a lot. A lot of people are also thinking about ways sort of at the at the design phase, when we're designing, new kinds of new technologies and sort of engineered systems within these bacteria, can we design a way that the bacteria can't grow if they're out in the wild, that they need to have the lab environment in order to be able to survive. And so there's a lot of different approaches there too. What if the cells, the way that it reads the genes in itself is totally different than how genes are read by natural organisms. That way, even the genes won't be able to be transferred because it'll be sort of gibberish to other organisms, and then they would need to have the sort of lab environment to be able to read their genes and grow. So there's definitely a lot of people sort of thinking about ways to sort of approach this problem. I think with the Venter Institute and the synthetic cell, a lot of it is actually, if you can design a whole cell from scratch, then you can also be you can be a little bit more sure about where it can grow and what kinds of, how it would behave if it got out. And that's something that they're definitely concerned about, even at sort of these very, very early stages of the design process.
So this is kind of an off-track question, but have you ever built anything that you were worried about?
Worried about?
Well, not worried about, but that you thought about, you built something through synthetic biology and then thought about, that could actually have kind of a problematic risk if I don't take steps to mitigate that.
No, I think the answer is no to that question. But I definitely, I think about it a lot, and so the stuff I worked on, bacteria that produce hydrogen in some conditions, and they produce very, very small amounts of hydrogen, enough that I could measure it in the lab, but not enough that it would be, you wouldn't actually build up enough hydrogen to even explode, even if it was in a small container. So that I wasn't, the changes that I made to that organism are very small and things that a lot of different people have done, one or two enzymes that changed. And then my other work that we talked about in our last conversation was about making the cyanobacteria, so photosynthetic bacteria that could sort of get inside of other cells and sort of be like the chloroplasts of plants. And so that one was definitely a little bit more, had a lot more thought going into the sort of safety aspects, because I was actually engineering the genes to be able to sort of behave like pathogens, but not actually be pathogens. So I definitely was worried about the genes, and much more, and we're always very careful about, how the things are done and how the experiments are controlled and performed. But in fact, so because the organisms are photosynthetic, even if they did get out in the environment and got into a cell, because they, by this very, very minute microscopic possibility, they wouldn't actually be able to survive because they wouldn't get any light. So, they can't, if they don't have any light, then they're not going to survive. So they're not going to be able to keep dividing and cause any problems. So that was something that sort of protected prevented my work from being, having any risks involved. But the risks are definitely, we as a community, we're very aware, we're aware and very active in sort of thinking about the risks involved in all of the experiments and sort of being really proactive, making sure that, we're talking to the right people and doing the right things, and I think it's only going to be more and more we're going to have to do, be aware of those things as more and more technologies are developed and deployed.
Right, and I think that it's interesting to me, how it's often difficult to know exactly what the risks are until you start trying something out and kind of start seeing how it interacts with these other systems. To think about energy again a little bit, I was thinking about the way that wind power interacts with the grid right now, and how, balancing out the fluctuations in wind generation to make sure that you always have that balance of generation to consumption on the grid, that sometimes that ends up meaning that you have to have a fossil fuel plant, usually a gas-fired fossil fuel plant, ramping its production up and down to kind of match the changes in the wind. And doing that makes the fossil fuel power plant run less efficiently. So you don't end up producing more, you don't get more fossil fuel emissions than you would have if you had no wind, but you get more fossil fuel emissions than you think you got by having this wind on the grid. You don't get all of the savings you thought you got because you have in the background this fossil fuel power plant having to run inefficiently to help the wind work. And I think that that's one of those things that it's hard to foresee until it's actually installed and working, and then you start to have to go back to what Venter was talking about, coming up with technology to fix the technology.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, and definitely what we have seen sort of with this ethanol, ethanol production, as sort of an alternative fuel. It's it comes from corn, which is a renewable resource, rather than fossil fuels, which are a non-renewable resource. But at the same time, you have to use so much energy to produce that corn and process it to a way that we can make ethanol that we end up having not a situation that's not better than fossil fuels.
Right, yeah. And I think that those kind of, that's something I find really interesting in terms of how scientists think about something compared to how lay people think about something. Because I think that most scientists see something like that happen and they think, well, okay, we've learned something new, we can, make these changes, and now we understand the system better and we'll try something else. But I think that a lot of times when you see that as a layperson, your first thought is, well, I've been lied to. Somebody scammed me on this system that they told me was going to work really well, and, well, see, now it doesn't work well, so I just can't trust anybody. And I think... I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, keep going.
Well, yeah, I think we need to do a better job of, whether, thinking about how we sell new technologies that are on this scale. I think we try to sell them a lot the way that we sell iPods, and they're really different. They're a really different category of technology, and they have all these different interactions that, to happen, but we don't know everything that's going to happen. And there kind of has to be that communication on that level about what we're doing so that people don't end up feeling like they've been cheated.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting problem, and the real tricky part is that it's not just a technical problem either, right? So it's not just the science of yeast producing ethanol that was involved in the problems that sort of emerged in sort of scaling up ethanol production, and there's political factors involved, what the subsidies involved in different kinds of production and how these factories sort of were subsidized. There are economic issues involved in sort of how much different fuels cost and how much different fuel sources cost and various other things too. So it's not just, these aren't things just for scientists to be able to figure out the sort of the details of the technical aspects of all of these systems, but also things that we need, politicians, political experts, economists, and and everyone really to be involved in these kinds of discussions. So it's hard. Yeah, I guess I don't really know, when it comes, since I'm a scientist, I don't know what regular people feel about these things. But I also feel like a regular person, and I see how, these are really complicated, and I see that these things are sort of happening without, and it's a big challenge, all of these things are big challenges. And so and need a multifaceted solution. So that's the biggest challenge, I think, at all, because it's hard to keep track of everything and to not feel like, there's somebody cheating us out of something. Right. It was actually reminds me. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to change. I was going to change the topic. So why don't you go ahead first?
Well, I was actually going to change the topic too. So I feel like we're at a yield sign. Go ahead first.
I was going to say that it sort of reminded me of geoengineering, which is something that I'm not sure if you talked about at the conference, but is sort of a new approach to dealing with climate change that has sort of been discussed recently, and people are starting to try and want to do sort of small scale experiments to see whether or not putting changing somehow the atmosphere will prevent some sort of sunlight or reflect sunlight and sort of help to cool the earth while we're producing all this carbon dioxide that heats up the earth. And so that as a sort of technological solution to a lot of these technological problems, it seems very sort of, I guess it's like a quick fix. It can seem like, we'll just cool it down and it'll be fine. And we can keep doing what we've been doing all along.
Right.
And it seems to me very terrifying and very risky, especially knowing sort of how all of these things are interconnected and how difficult it is to do all of these things. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to bring up. What do you?
Oh yeah, no, I think that that's a really good point. We didn't talk about geoengineering at the conference. It was kind of more focused on energy production and to a lesser extent energy efficiency, and also a lot about politics and how
mm-hmm.
that shapes what you can and can't do with energy.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the geoengineering thing is also really interesting, and it's something that I think in the last week there was a poll that came out showing that people were more accepting of the idea of geoengineering than we had thought they had been.
Mm-hmm.
We are, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that, we have this thing that is essentially geoengineering. The problem of climate change is that we have geoengineered the planet, and we are running this geoengineering experiment on ourselves right now,
mm-hmm.
and we're trying to figure out, whether we can stop the bad side of that experiment with another experiment where, again, the only way to know what actually happens is to test it out.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that we can entirely write off geoengineering,
mm-hmm.
but I think that it's something to be really, really careful about. It's definitely not a, silver bullet solution to things. Because if you think about, one of the things I think is really interesting, and that we talked about yesterday when we had this conversation before, was that, we've had some really interesting patterns in how global warming has progressed compared to how it was originally predicted to progress.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those things is that we had a big speed up in warming that
mm-hmm.
people weren't necessarily expecting. And then over the last, maybe 15 or 20 years, it's slowed a little bit, and we haven't had as much warming as we were expecting to have.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ideas about why that has worked out in that way is that you had Western countries putting a cap, hard lines on sulfur dioxide emissions, which are something that can inhibit global warming
mm-hmm.
in the atmosphere. And then turning around and having China and India and all these other developing countries start producing a lot more sulfur dioxide because they're producing a lot more energy. So
mm-hmm.
you kind of seen the heat increases fluctuate
mm-hmm.
with the sudden decrease in sulfur dioxide concentrations and then a sudden increase in sulfur dioxide concentrations. And now there's this concern about, what happens when people in China get tired of the side effects of sulfur dioxide, things like lung and heart problems and things like acid rain, and
mm-hmm.
start wanting their own limits on that. How are we going to get another big increase in heat if that happens?
Mm-hmm.
And, that's another geoengineering experiment we're running, and we're already doing these things. And so, I think that there is a real appeal to geoengineering because
mm-hmm.
it feels like a simple solution, instead of having to go back and think about how fast can we get the U.S. vehicle fleet to turn over, what do we have to do to make this technology work, to balance out
mm-hmm.
the side effects of that technology. If you can clear away all of those confusing, multifaceted solutions and just have one thing that works, yeah, that's a hell of a lot more appealing. I would much rather have just one fix that works.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think geoengineering does that. I think
mm-hmm.
people like it because they think it might do that. But I don't think it does that.
I hope that nobody is actually proposing to put sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere on purpose in order to, as a geoengineering experiment. Is that true? Do you know about that?
So I don't know necessarily a whole lot about geoengineering. I know that there have been groups in Russia that proposed putting other kinds of particulate matter in the atmosphere to basically do the same kind of thing that sulfur dioxide does.
Yeah, I think I heard about water vapor as one of the options. And water vapor, at least it's not pollution combating climate change. But
right.
But it is sort of a drastic, I guess, approach still.
Yeah, and I don't remember all of the different things they were talking about putting up there, but it's ideas that work along the same lines, basically. Mm-hmm. Just hopefully would have fewer, wouldn't have acid rain and all the other stuff that comes along with sulfur dioxide.
Oh gosh, yeah. And I mean, I've heard other proposals for carbon sequestration, so get how to speed up the way that plants or algae pick up carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Somebody proposed actually dumping iron into the ocean so that it would promote the growth of algae and photosynthetic bacteria in the ocean, which would sort of grow to such a degree that they would just be pulling all the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which again, sort of, what we were talking about with, if a synthetic organism goes and fills the ocean up with these algae, that's exactly what they were proposing to do. It's a sort of interesting, I don't know how much support that proposal had, but it also kind of terrifying.
Well, I think it's also hard to kind of separate out, when you're hearing about these things, the idea somebody had somewhere this one time versus stuff that actually has, some kind of support and going somewhere. Mm-hmm. And I don't know within that field of geoengineering what is talk and what is more than talk.
What is real, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So this has been a really good conversation. I'm glad we were able to have this conversation again. I feel like we hit some new topics and had some new stuff to talk about too.
Yeah, this is great. It was really nice to talk to you. As usual.
It was great talking to you also. Yeah, and we should, every day, absolutely, yeah. Let's do it again tomorrow.
Sounds good. Okay.
Cool. Well, you have a good afternoon, and I'll look forward to talking to you again.
You too. Talk to you later.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.